All right. So welcome everybody. We're going to talk about Eureka. No, actually we're not. For once. We're going to talk about FQM. So this is an update to FQM. It was introduced last year at WOLFcon, and there have been a lot of great changes since then. Matt Weaver was originally meant to be here, and he could help presentation as well, but he's online, I hope, and can step in if he needs to.
Yep, I'm here.
Great, thanks, Matt. So let's talk about the new stuff in FQM. So, all right, so we're going to show these new capabilities or these new features that we're adding in here, including this notion of composite entities and the ability to create much more granular and Lego block type entity types. So to do that, let's give you a bit of background on FQM if you're not familiar with it, then talk about dynamic queries, the permission model that we've extended into this, the introduction of composite entities, the ability we've had to vastly increase the number of entities we have in FQM. And FQM is now extended its support into the ECS, that's the enhanced consortial support. So if you're running a consortial node with multiple tenants, you can use FQM across the tenants to some degree. And finally, some facilities we have for upgrading your FQM system as you go from release to release. All right, so a little background for those not familiar, FQM is the FOLIO query machine. It's basically driven through an API. It allows you to get at data from other modules within FOLIO. Its intention is primarily for operational reporting and maybe some additional efficiencies in cross module data extraction. It doesn't require any export and movement of data into another system for reporting. It's all done within FOLIO. It works across the modules, and in case you weren't familiar, it does currently power the list app that is basically a very dedicated version of FQM. All right, the key concepts that we have are that FQM delivers record sets, each comprised of records, which is a simple concept, and data fields. An entity, also sometimes referred to as an entity type, is sort of an FQM concept. It represents sort of the slice of data that you're trying to get at. It's a queryable relation, something that comes out of a query that maybe pulls in a bunch of related fields from different places. And entity types always have one or more ID fields within them to identify them. The query is the mechanism that you use to generate an entity type. FQM query syntax is FQL. It's the FOLIO query language. It's Mongo-like DB. It's a JSON-like syntax, which has gotten some good feedback in terms of making very flexible queries. All right, so then this is sort of a high-level view of what it looks like. FQM is its own application. It consists of a number of different things. Applications will basically communicate to FQM through the FQM APIs. Some user will talk to applications. Could be like, for example, this app, if there are other apps. FQM has an FQM manager component, which is, yes?
You're sharing the screen.
I'm not sharing screen. Oh, jeez. I almost had it right. Are we seeing it?
Most people can see it, looks like, yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, I'll continue. So then FQM manages essentially two schemas for data within itself. One is its own sort of internal schema, which is about the entity definitions that are created within FQM. This is where all the definitions exist. And the actual data that comes from those entity definitions, which is pulled from other storage units that belong to other modules. So it'll pull back from circulation data. As far as the FQM is concerned, it thinks it's only handling its own data. It's got data that lives here as source data. It doesn't necessarily know this is coming directly from other things. It considers it its own data in keeping with the microservice model. All right, so now let's talk about the new stuff that's going on. So the first thing that we're doing is dynamic queries. Here's a picture of what FQM looked like in 2023 with the Poppy release. Essentially consists of an FQM API, within which we define some entities. So I've created these two entities here, inventory and circulation. They're fictitious. There isn't actually an entity called that, but conceptually, let's just go with that. So the entity is defined in FQM, and what it does is it pulls data from the inventory storage. It'll say pull out instances holding in items, and it pulls them out through a view mechanism. So it creates a complex view, it's a complex query, and it joins it, it extracts the data, columns that it wants, returns it back to the entity construct, and the entity construct will maybe put it in a layer of abstraction it has to interpret what the columns mean, right? So it's just basically trying to see this column that comes out of a SQL query and understands what it is. So it does some level of mapping and there's some metadata enhancement there. And similarly, you may have a second entity, circulation entity, that has its own complex view, complex SQL, that also pulls for inventory, but maybe pulls in some loan data, pulls in some user data. And the whole thing is gated by an API permission that lives like all APIs and permissions FOLIO at the API level for FQM. So you have permission to run queries through FQM or you don't. So with Cosnelia, we've removed this complex view in the middle. So it no longer needs to do that. And what does it do now? We have dynamic generation of the FQM queries. So the benefit of doing that is that we have more granular composition of the query that generates the entity. And the definition of that is completely contained within the entity definition. Previously, as I mentioned, FQM would rely on interpreting whatever came out of the view in terms of column names and then apply some kind of mapping. But now we have sort of a much more efficient way of doing this and a more granular way of composing a dynamic query. But this is a relatively minor improvement. And looks kind of like this. We take away that view, and now the responsibility for column extraction, understanding how to interpret the data, and metadata, this all in the joint itself happens in the entity definition and entity production, which is certainly an efficiency. So no more complex views, just source views that pull the data from relevant tables. So as I pointed out here, right, you have this permission. At the top, FQM would rely on a single permission that lets you run FQM calls or not. It's an API level thing. So that's not great security-wise. So now we're introducing permissions at the entity level. So instead of saying, well, you have permission that you can run a query and you can run a query on users, you can run a query on whatever entities are there. Now we have permissions specific to the actual entity that you're trying to consume through FQM, right? So that means that in order to run a particular query, the user, which could be a system, needs to have both the permission to run a query through the FQM API, but also to have permissions to the specific entity that they want to run. So it's a much better way of working. And so it's much more secure this way. And it eventually, as pointed out here, allows us to go even further and have column level security so that maybe you can run a query on some costing and some acquisition orders, but you can't see the costing data. You can only see the rest of it. So this potentially could be enabled in the future by this mechanism. So it looks like
and in
this.
case it wasn't clear, those permissions are the ones that come from other modules that we already use. And so users shouldn't have access to something in FQM if they don't already have access to it through another application. So you can't access like user data without already having access to user data.
Correct. Yeah, and I think we covered. Do we cover that later? I don't remember if it's another slide, but yes, and that's a key point. So
I thought we did, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, it might be another slide, but yeah. So the key point there is that the entities themselves are eventually referred back to the data that's here. And so if you want to have access to inventory, then you're going to have a permission to retrieve data from inventory, which is assigned through the inventory application, and it will line up. So this is the picture that it looks like now. So now we've introduced entity permissions. In order to get to any one of these data, you have to have both sets of permissions to get it in here. And these are still relatively coarse level in the sense that you're getting access to this entire entity here, which includes maybe 3 data sets on the back end. So, and how does this work? And I think this was the slide here that you're getting to, Matt, which is, so we need to have both of these. And the challenge, of course, is if you wanted to say, I need to construct this entity here, circulation, that is going to have permissions there. The entity permission has to find out whether there's permission in inventory, permission on circulation. It needs to have all of these permissions. And you could potentially, embed that as a required permission dependency in the declaration, but it's going to get really complex really fast, and it's very hard to maintain because it's in the definition, right? So because of that, and because FQM is a privileged module, in other words, it already has the ability to sort of cross that boundary between data storage of modules, it does its own permission checking. So unlike any other module in FOLIO, really, that doesn't really worry itself about permissions. I mean, most modules just go about their business and they rely on the authorization boundary to grant access to the APIs or not. In other words, that could be, a copy doing things, or it could be through keycloak and sidecars in Eureka. So FQM is slightly different. It will actually make calls into mock permissions to confirm whether the caller actually has been assigned the permissions that are needed. So it's a little bit different this way, but it does allow us to have the tighter controls on access that we want to have. Okay, so the next big development is the concept of, and this is a big one, is composite entities. So the definition is that a simple entity is something that basically is constructed from data that comes directly from the database. A composite entity gets its data from simple entities. It's composed of other entities, whether they're simple or composite. And this is a tremendous building block. So now it looks like this. So we have the FQM API at the top. We have inventory entity, sort of the inventory and circulation entities, which can now be seen as constructed from the composition of simple entities. So we have these simple entities, which are kind of simple, single purpose, that map to specific items or objects in the data. And each of them, because they are still, after all, entities, could have permissions. So we now have a much more granular mechanism that allows further protection at a lower level of the data you get access to, but also it's highly composable, I suppose is the word. And so how does that work, right? So the entity definition itself carries a source type property, and you can identify the source type, the entity to be either a DB, which implies it's a simple entity, or you can make an entity type, which is the source. In other words, it's pulling from other entities, which indicates that it's a composite entity. So, and there's some levels of controls as to exactly what you can or choose to pull in from the entities that you're building the composite entity on. So keep in mind, though, that composite entities can be composed out of other composite entities. They just merely need to be composed from entities. So you can go crazy with that probably, but ultimately, when we process these to run them, they need to be flattened. We need to have essentially simple DB sources at the very bottom so that we have something that is executable in an efficient manner. In the flattening process, though, we do preserve the hierarchy that goes there. So an example here, if you had, entity A that is containing entity B and referring to column ABC, the name of the flattened entity would essentially be that segmented version, which preserves the information as to what was originally intended before it was flattened. Okay. So some of the benefits of doing this process of composite entities is we have less repetition, right? Because we can sort of focus on creating very data specific, you have a circulation entity, or you have an inventory entity. They maybe both go after the same bit of information from inventory data, but you can just do it once, and then you can compose and build on top of that. It's a Lego building block approach. So less mixing concerns. Right now we have composite entities can be focused on sort of building answers to solutions. It's about the data relationships. It's about how you're pulling the data together. Simple entities can mostly be concerned with specific data sources and the permissions that are tied to those. So in other words, back here, you can see that, we're putting entity permissions at the entity, at the items and at the simple entity level. So which is that separation of concern. So this is sort of the data retrieval and permissioning, and this is the higher level business level of gathering the data relationships. Okay, make sure I don't miss anything. Right, okay, so yeah, it'd be easier permission management and as a future development would be the ability to introduce the concept of the user created composite entities. Right now, whether it's simple entities or composite entities, those are defined on the back end as part of the application. Eventually, we'd like to get to a point where we can certainly compose these by the end users in FOLIO. Descriptive column names are being maintained, so we touched on that a little bit. We have that relationship as the entity composition follows the hierarchy of the tree and right down to the column name. And ultimately, right, this is about lower maintenance for how you manage and create entities, and which means that we can now benefit from that and have more data as well. So one of the other changes that we've had since last year is that the number of entities that are now available has vastly increased over what was announced last year at WOLFcon. So, with the introduction of this simple and composite entities, we have essentially a Lego building block structure that lets you create these pretty quickly. As an example, last year we had about 250 columns exposed to 8 different entities. In Ramson's coming up soon, we will have 1,400 planned with across 7 entities, kind of the same ones, just we combine a couple of them. So as an example, Castalia, the items entity, had 1 piece of data from holdings. It had the holding record ID. Now it will have 29 pieces. So the scale at which we can build entities has been tremendously improved. As part of that, there's a tool that comes for developers within the code base, which is the developer to create entities. So essentially an interactive tool that let you specify some source data and then build up sort of interactively the entity the composite entity that you want to create, and it will generate, I assume, the composite entity that the definition of that composite entity. Matt, and this has helped tremendously in what we're doing. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, what's also notable is you can take the schema definition from an R&B module or Springwave module, and you can literally copy and paste it directly into the entity type creator, and it'll do probably about 85 to 90% of the work for you, extracting all of the column names and data types, and where possible, I believe it even does some data relationships. I could be wrong on that one. But so rather than having developers handwriting hundreds and hundreds of lines of just pure JSON, we can generate the vast majority of it so that the only real work that's required by developers for the most part is just going through and double checking, making sure everything's okay, and then adding in some like column name translations and things like that. And so this dramatically increases the speed in which we can do things. In fact, it's actually become a bit of a problem where we're actually able to add new data fields so fast, it's kind of hard to keep up with them with validating the correctness of them. And so we may not actually end up with the full 1,400 fields within Ramson's just because we're able to generate them so much faster than we can actually validate that they are correct. So it's a good problem to have.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another key area that we've got in FQM now is FQM support has been extended into the ECS world, to the consortial support world. So implicitly, everything so far has been within a single tenant within FOLIO. You could run your queries across the different modules that exist in the tenant. But with ECS, you will have distributed tenants, and you'll have maybe a central tenant, and you want to be able to gather, whatever it is, some information across all of them, however you just choose to distribute data amongst the tenants. So ECS support has been introduced. We've got, minimal but sufficient introduction of those right now. So we support cross-tenant queries now for certain entity types, especially the ones in inventory. So it's instances, holdings, and items. The queries themselves can run in the central tenant and will pull data in from any of the member tenants to which the person running the query has affiliation. So in ECS, you have controlled access to different tenants based on your affiliation. So if you are a user that has access to 3 tenants, it will pull from 3 tenants. If you're the other user that only has access to 2, you will pull from 2 tenants as part of your top level queries from FQM. To do this, we sort of include some information in the data that comes back. In particular, we need to have the let me just kill this. We have the tenant ID that has to be included as this, because as the data gets aggregated between them, we need to be able to distinguish which tenant the data was sourced from before we aggregate. So it's the tenant ID. So this is how it works, and then there was how the query will be performed, but then what needs to be done with the entity definitions themselves. So you need to essentially ensure that you add that tenant ID to any ECS intended query and entity definition, and also specify any ECS columns, specific columns that you only want to have seen in ECS. And an additional property is to set the cross-tenant queries property to true, so that you enable this particular entity definition to be run in ECS mode. Matt, anything you want to add to that?
No, not that I can think of. It's pretty straightforward, I think.
Okay. All right. And so what does that look like, essentially? So this is sort of visually what that means, is that you've got an ECS configuration, you've got a central tenant, a couple of data tenants. You've got your typical setup here, right? You've got a shared instance record in the central tenant with a corresponding shadow record in the data tenant with local holding and items off of that. But you may also have a local instance record with some stack of holding and items as well. So if you are a user and you are working directly in the data tenant and you run your FQM query, what can you retrieve back? Well, you obviously retrieve back anything that is local, because you're working locally in the tenant. So you'll see this green here. You will also see anything associated with the shared instances. So it's basically a local configuration, and you're pulling back the shared instance, which is represented by the shadow instance here. You will not see something in another tenant because you are working locally, even if you have affiliations there, you won't see that. Now, you could also be running FQM from the central tenant. And so what do you get to see there? Well, so you get to see, assuming you have affiliations in these 2 tenants, you will see from this, you'll see any shared instance across any of the tenants that you have and the stack that goes with those. You will see any local instances in the tenants to which you have affiliations. And in the future, you'll also be able to see the holdings and items related to that instance. Oh, so future is now. This is actually working now, essentially. So
Yep.
this came about in the last week since I made this diagram. So it's all green. It's all green on the other side. Okay. And so how does this work again? So essentially the way that FQM works in ECS mode is it goes and checks out, the tenant's affiliations and sees which tenants are eligible to participate in an ECS query. And that the user has permissions to see the data in each of those, because affiliations work with separate permissions in each tenant. We build the SQL query like normal, but we essentially delegate a separate query to each of the tenants that are going to be in play. The results are combined with the union all, and we preserve the tenant ID in the ID column, so it becomes clear which tenant sourced the particular data piece. All right, so moving on, upgrade support. So there is some support built into FQM that'll help with the upgrade process when you move to a new version. So specifically, and one of the challenges we always have in something like this that reaches across schemas is how to manage the changes in schema that occur from one version to another. So FQL, which is the query language that FQM uses, the definitions of the queries will contain an FQM version property. So that's how we track whether there's a new version that needs to be accounted for. So what this tool does, there's a tool built in that essentially provides an API that other modules can use to upgrade their own stored queries. So if you have a stored query, you send your current query to FQM and you get back the upgraded query that corresponds to any breaking or schema changes that have occurred, right? And the changes that are going to be supported by this tool, you can report back any columns that have changed, any renaming of columns so that you have a proper name. The entity IDs may have changed, so that'll be accounted for. And anything with the FQL syntax or operator changes as we add capabilities to FQL, there may be additional operators that come into play, so that will be supported as well. Plan, right? FQM will maybe do this dynamically as the query is executed. So rather than have you submit these and fix them and update them, it might be able to catch these on the fly the first time you run them. Is that right, Matt?
Yep, that's what we're planning. And one thing that kind of stands out that sets us apart from pretty much anything else that I know of in Folio is it makes it so that other modules that deal with FQM, they don't have to do a big complicated upgrade process every time FQM changes something internally. So if we change add a new operator in FQM or remove an old operator and there's some way to automatically migrate from the old version to the new one, the list module won't have to deal with the internals of an FQL query that we don't really want to make it think about. Instead, it can just proactively reach out to FQM whenever it does its own upgrade, whenever List upgrades. List can ask FQM, hey, I have all these queries. What should they look like now? And take care of that all automatically without any changes required inside of mod lists. And so it should make life a whole lot easier for other modules that depend on FQM and dramatically cut down on the manual effort needed by operators on various installations to deal with like flower releases and things like that. Because otherwise that would be a bit of a nightmare.
And the last point here about incremental releases, this is kind of a statement that FQM really wants to embrace the changes that are going to be made possible with application support, where applications can release and develop at their own cadence. And FQM in particular feels the need to do that, to release more frequently than simply the flower releases, which will mean, fewer breaking changes and easier and more frequent releases because you're making smaller changes every time. So that's kind of a statement of support, I think, for incremental releasing. All right. So, FQM, with list app, right? But FQM actually is usable not just for doing reporting of things internally for operational needs, but also in an effort different with applications. So currently, and this is an old slide, you may have seen this before, but FQM essentially sits on the back end here with storage, pulls in data from various other module storage. It powers the list apps. So the list app has a UI, it'll run queries against it for the query builder, and then it'll construct its list here and execute here. But there are other possibilities. So bulk edit, which has been featured in other presentations, also makes use of FQM. So bulk edit is a two-phase process that essentially involves first generating a list of particular objects that you want to edit in batch. In other words, apply a change to all of them, but you don't want to do all of them, you want to filter it. So FQM is there to let you run a query across possibly different areas to define and limit the set of results that you want to apply your bulk changes to. So FQM plays a role in the first phase to limit the number of items and create essentially a list from which you will make updates. FQM is an edge API. which is used for external integrations. I didn't cover any of the API stuff right now, but we talked about it last year a little bit. FQM has powerful APIs, including a asynchronous API, where you can submit a query and get the result later. And there are some possible other benefits in the future. Delete operations has come up in the past. The notion there is that if you take something like an item in FOLIO and you want to delete an item record, you say, well, can I do that? Because maybe not, because maybe it's part of an order pending, so I can't just delete the record. Maybe it's out of circulation, or maybe there are other conditions, and there are various conditions, things that rely on an item. So in order to delete the item, you really have to go make an API call inventory, make sure it's not, there's some special property. You have to call acquisitions and make sure that there's no order against it. You have to call circulation. You do all these API calls, and it gets very expensive to just delete one item. So what FQM can do is it can pull together a single entity that checks and maps out all of the things, all of the rules that you need to apply. And you would say, well, has one column that says on alone, yes, no, true, false. On order, true, false. And then if you match all the criteria, that's one call, one API call to FQM, and you can do an efficient deletion operation. So this is one of the ideas. But data import also has the possibility of benefiting from this. And I don't have them all here, but there are other frequent conversations from other modules and applications that would really need to have this sort of functionality. Okay, so finally, I'll give a few words about FQM next, right? What's going on next with FQM? This has been the last year up to Ramson's. So the immediate focus is to provide sort of a deeper and better integration with Eureka capabilities, by which we mean capabilities in Eureka is about identifying the resource specifically and the operations that a user can get to it. Users don't get permissions to get access to capabilities. So we can do a much better mapping of the permissions of a user effectively into the data sets this way. And eventually, this is what I think will get us to the point where we can sort of eliminate certain columns from the report. In other words, you might run a report, but you don't have access to some of the permissions and capabilities, so we will just suppress those in the report, but you can still run the actual query itself. Longer term, so there are many things that could be powered by FQM. So one idea is to provide native reporting application inside of FOLIO that will let you do operational reports and things that you may want to just find out anything that's going on there. And that could potentially be integrated with the Eureka scheduler. Eureka is providing its own scheduler, so you could run a report on schedules, delay it, or run it on a frequent basis if you wish. Now, getting these reports is one thing, but you could also imagine this could go into a dashboard. We could add cards in the dashboard that are powered by FQM. Potentially, you can get into centralized notifications from the results of FQM. What's been maybe asked for a few times is to get kind of an entity type explorer, so you could drill down and get sort of a representation of what's in the composite entities and expose the structures of the columns that are there and the permissions that are needed to run. Because remember, right now, all these entities are defined on the back end. And as a user of the system, you really get to use the entities. You don't necessarily get to go in depth and understand the details of what's in there. So it's about transparency. And eventually, maybe some open search integration would be good. In other words, we could, on the one hand, build indexes on the entities that are created. We could also make them searchable, and we could go the other way, and we could support maybe search queries in the entity definitions themselves. Some of these are just wild ideas, but these are all possibilities of what could be powered by FQM. And that's it. So, any questions on that? Craig?
I have a question about the upgrade support. I want to go back to the slide for a second.
I will.
You don't have to, but I'm wondering how does FQM know that the database structure has changed, data model has changed, and sort of one of these MC tables, right? And how does it know? Does it look directly at the data structure, or is it getting that information from somewhere else?
It's a Matt question, but I think it mostly has to do with the entity definitions themselves rather than the source data. But Matt, you want to answer that?
Yeah, so we would find out about the change, ideally from the development team that makes the change, which has happened. We actually have one that we know about in our inventory entities right now that we need to update. And so, yeah, when we find out about those changes, which, like I said, ideally we get from the dev team. If not, we discover it while testing and things like that. And we actually do have some plans to find a way to automate that a bit too. So we just find out pretty much immediately when they change. But yeah, we would then make the change in the entity type definition. And then the way that FQM will know that it needs to upgrade a query to a newer version is using that FQM version property that is part of the FQL query. The plan is for that version to be optional. And so if it's not there, it's just going to assume that it needs to be upgraded from the earliest version, and it'll just start trying to automatically do its thing, which is why we're saying that everyone should include the FQM version just to prevent it from doing more work than necessary and possibly actually changing the query in an unexpected way. But yeah, the upgrade support would be in the entity type definitions themselves and not in the underlying schema from the source data.
And follow-on question, some modules use JSON-D, and other modules use sort of traditional relational database structure with multiple columns, right? So does FQM support both of those?
It does, and JSON-B is the bane of our existence because that's nearly everything is like that. But yeah, it supports both fairly easily. Within the column definitions inside an entity, you specify how exactly to extract the data that you want for that column. And so in some cases, it's really simple, it's the ID column or whatever. In other cases, you do have to tell it, go into the JSON-B column and then dive into this nested data structure. And then inside that is another one. And it can dive arbitrarily deep into the whole JSON-B structure.
Mark.
It's all coming to composite entity types. Do they have to wait for the new release to have it deployed, or it can be deployed to production before the next development?
Did you catch that, Matt?
I did not catch any of that at all.
All right, I can try and repeat it and try to answer it. So the question was, if somebody wants to consume an upgraded or a recently added composite entity type, do they have to wait until the next release of FOLIO, I assume, or do we have the ability to push that out into production without a release, I suppose? It's data at that point, right?
Yep. So yeah, with our support for automatically migrating queries, it should make it so you can upgrade just FQM on its own without having to upgrade the rest of FOLIO to be able to pick up new changes. And then adding new data to entities is fairly simple. It's effectively a configuration change. And so for the most part, we can make those changes very safely without having to worry too much about breaking things. And then the whole point of the upgrade support is it takes the whole class of things that could normally be considered a breaking change and converts them into something that FQM can just deal with very easily on the fly. And so it should make that process much less painful. So it should make it so we don't have to wait for full flower releases to add more data to FQM.
A follow-on question. So if, let's say, one institution develops a new composite type, can that composite entity be applied to another institution?
The question was, if one institution develops a new composite entity, can that same composite entity be applied to another institution's setup?
So right now, we don't provide an easy way to do that. Like I said, it is effectively a database change, though. So in cases where the institutions have access to the database and they're willing to manually change the database, it would just be a matter of adding a row or two to a database table. That was one thing we touched on earlier, though, that may be in the cards. We're still considering the possibility of allowing users to create their own entity types. And so that would also provide that mechanism. And then with the addition of the entity type creator, hopefully it makes it easier for people to actually create new entity types and not have to go dive into the JSON to do it. But yeah, with any kind of luck, before too long, we'll have a pretty straightforward mechanism to let users both create entity types and then share them between institutions. We do want to be kind of careful about that because one thing to bear in mind is FQM does run queries directly on the database, which is why we always recommend people use it with a read replica so that it's not putting heavy load on the main source of data for a FOLIO instance. And so we do want to make sure that we're generally fairly judicious about new entity types because we don't want to put something in that's going to just take down the database by making every single query hit every single table and do a sequence scan on the whole database every time. But yeah, we're hoping to figure out a good balance between the flexibility of letting users create their own entities while at the same time having some guardrails in place to make it so we're not just giving someone a giant gun that's loaded and cocked and pointed straight at their foot, because we don't like foot guns.
All right, so I see Mark has a hand up, but I'm gonna give Todd a chance to speak now, not just Mark.
Well, on a related note, are you finding places where the kind of complex entities you want to construct and queries you want to do with them are suggesting perhaps changes to indexing or data layout that might be beneficial to build reporting and transaction processing or the conflict? How's that starting?
So I'm sure you didn't catch any of that. So the question was, are we encountering use cases for complex queries that might benefit from changes in the original source data with schema changes or other things, right?
Indexing changes.
And indexing changes as well.
We found a few cases where it's somewhat difficult to deal with just the existing data structure, but for the most part, the schemas themselves haven't been too much trouble. We've been able to find workarounds in cases where it is being difficult. But indexes for sure, because FQM does run queries directly on the database, it is very much bounded by the performance of the database. And so indexes make a very big difference. We have found quite a few instances where it's fundamentally always very, very slow just because there's not an index that we can set it up to use. But when the indexes are there, we are able to have a pretty fine-grained control about what indexes or the structure of the queries that FQM produces to make good use of indexes. And so we've actually just started the process of reaching out to other teams to see if they can add some simple indexes to their storage modules to support FQM. There's some pretty big downsides to indexing everything. And so we're trying to be careful about what ones we actually ask for, and we want to target the ones that users will actually use. And then we do have some pretty simple guidance on what users can do to take slow queries and speed them up. But yeah, for sure, the indexes that exist on the existing data are probably the biggest contributing factor to the performance within FQM. One of our dreams is to figure out a way to integrate FQM with OpenSearch just to make use of the massive collection of indexes we have there. Because there's a lot of instances where you can go to, for example, the inventory module and do a search on something like statistical codes and get results almost immediately. And then you go to FQM and the exact same query is very slow. And that's an example where we just don't have an index we can use. And if we could leverage the existing indexes in OpenSearch, then we can speed things up dramatically. We don't know what that would look like yet. It's still just an idea that we're thinking through. But yeah, with any kind of luck, we can leverage something like that and not have to try and convince every team to put indexes on a whole bunch of fields that they otherwise wouldn't. I hope that answers the question. That was a lot of words for a bit of rambling.
All right, so Ross, you have a question?
Yeah, the question is about the ECS support. When you send the request to the central tenant, it will be distributed to the data tenant based on the user creation. But as I understand, for every data tenant, the permission of the user in that tenant will be applied as well. And it will lead sometimes to quite unexpected results because the user can have permission in this tenant and can have permission in that tenant. And the combined result set, as I understand, can be not that improved.
Yeah,
So is it true?
yes, that's true. I think that, so I'm not sure you caught all that, Matt, but the point being that because we first check to see the user's permission in the target data tenant before we execute the query there, we will disqualify the entire tenant from that result that gets aggregated for them. So yes, so you will get different results, right? Based on who is querying. Which is the intention, you know, if you don't have access to data, then you shouldn't be able to pull it back through FQM. Okay, oh, Mark.
Linguistic question, if I may. What's the proper way to say composite entity or composite?
Oh, so maybe we should take a vote on that. Mark wants to know if it's composite or composite.
Let's say composite.
Yes.
Clearly, it's composite, right? I mean,
Yeah. Either that or the composite people are very shy. Yes, Dennis.
One, this is probably a silly question for most people in the room, but I want to just make sure I understand what's happening. So there's a storage module for FQM that you showed in the diagram there.
Yep.
But you're not just storing the entity definitions, you're actually storing data that you're pulling from these other modules.
No, we're storing they're views, so they're not really storing the data there. They're just accessing it through a virtual, but what appears to be a storage for FQM.
When they're asked.
When asked, yeah, so it's live data.
So there's no worry that you're getting something that's old, there's no refresh.
No,
like,
it's real, alive,
Yeah.
to the extent of, you know, replication if you're using that replicated copy. Okay. Any other questions? If not, we got 2 minutes for another question. Okay, well, in that case, thank you, everybody.
yep. Thank you, everybody, for your time.